And finally, Olivia said, her voice amplified by a microphone filled the cavernous great room of her new Austin mansion. A toast to my mother, Emma. The words hung in the air, shimmering under the light of the crystal chandeliers. My daughter, my beautiful, polished daughter, standing on a makeshift stage, her champagne flute held aloft like a trophy. She was celebrating her 35th birthday. At least that was the official story. In reality, she was celebrating this house, this life, this monument to her own success that I had secretly, completely and foolishly financed. She's been a loving burden. There it was. The period at the end of a sentence I hadn't even known was being written. 4 words. 4 perfectly enunciated poison-tipped darts. A loving burden. The room, a sea of 100 smiling, drinking, celebrating people, fell utterly silent. It wasn't a respectful silence. It was the heavy, vacuum-sealed silence of a car wreck. The sound of 100 minds simultaneously processing a violation of social code. The music, some trendy, bass-heavy track, seemed to stutter and fade into the background, suddenly obscene in its cheerfulness. From my table, the one tucked away by the swinging doors to the kitchen, I had a perfect, panoramic view of my own execution. I was placed here, I'd been told, so I could be comfortable, away from the noise. The truth was, I was placed here to be invisible, an inconvenient piece of furniture you hide when important guests come over. The metallic tang of dishwasher steam puffed into my face every time a server bustled through, a rhythmic counterpoint to the scent of expensive perfume I could smell but not wear. I saw the change happen in real time. The faces that had been turned towards Olivia with adoration now swiveled, searching. Their eyes, like hesitant spotlights, swept the room until they found me, the old woman by the service entrance. I saw it on the face of a woman in a glittering gold dress. Her smile froze, cracked, and was replaced by a wide-eyed pity that felt worse than any insult. I saw it in the man next to her, a portly gentleman in a tight suit who coughed loudly into his fist and suddenly became fascinated by the ice cubes in his drink. I saw a young woman, her phone still held up to record an Instagram story, lower it slowly, her thumb hovering over the delete button. This moment was too real, too raw for her curated feed. Olivia, my daughter, just stood there, basking in the shockwave she had created. She had a small, practiced smile on her face, the kind she used when she felt she'd said something clever and profound. She actually thought this was a touching sentiment. She thought she was being vulnerable, honest. She was performing the role of the dutiful daughter, weighed down by the burden of an aging parent, and she expected applause for her martyrdom. A constant reminder, she continued, her voice regaining its confident melodic tone, trying to pull the moment back from the brink, of our duty to family. She raised her glass higher, the signal for the spell to be broken. A few people, her closest friends, the ones who were in on the joke, clapped tentatively. It sounded like a handful of dry leaves skittering across pavement. Then a few more joined in, a ripple of obligatory applause, but the damage was done. The word was out. Burden. It was hanging in the air, clinging to the velvet drapes and reflected in the polished marble floors. It had attached itself to me. I was no longer Emma Vance. I was the burden. My hand was resting on my own glass of water. Not champagne. They hadn't thought to bring me any. The crystal was cool and heavy. I could feel the fine ridges of the cut glass pattern under my fingertips. I focused on that feeling, the solidity of it. It was the only thing that felt real. My own breathing was a distant sound, something happening to someone else. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were floating near the ceiling, looking down at the scene. There's the birthday girl, a vision in silk. There are her adoring fans. And there, over by the kitchen, is the sad old mother. The anchor, the weight, the burden. I risked a glance at her husband, Mark. He stood just to the side of the stage, his arms crossed. He wasn't looking at Olivia with pride. He was looking out at the crowd, a smug, satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He caught my eye for a fraction of a second. There was no sympathy in his gaze, only triumph. He had known she was going to say it. He had probably encouraged it. He was a co-conspirator in my public humiliation. The old person smell he'd complained about last week was just a prelude. This was the main event. A server, a young man with a kind, flustered face, pushed through the kitchen doors and almost bumped my chair. "Excuse me, ma'am," he mumbled, his cheeks red. He wasn't looking at me, but at the spectacle. Even the hired help knew. Everyone knew. The word echoed. Burden, burden, burden. It wasn't a new thought. I had felt it in the way Olivia sighed when I asked a question. I had seen it in the way she handed me leftovers from a meal I wasn't invited to share. I had heard it in the condescending, baby talk voice she used when explaining how to use the new television remote. But it had always been an unspoken accusation, a ghost in the halls of this house I paid for. Now, it was a proclamation, a public branding. I thought of Robert, my late husband. I could almost hear his voice, not the soft, loving one from our quiet evenings, but the sharp, clear voice of the businessman who built an empire from nothing. "Never let them see your whole hand, Emma," he used to say. And always keep an ace tucked away. Always. For the past 2 years since his death, I had forgotten that. I had laid all my cards on the table, a loving, trusting fool. I had handed over my entire life savings, my security, my very identity, to the daughter he had always warned me was more concerned with appearances than with substance. Olivia was mingling now, laughing as if she hadn't just vivisected her own mother in front of 100 witnesses. People were coming up to her, hugging her, their discomfort carefully masked by effusive birthday wishes. They would talk about this in their cars on the way home. Can you believe what she said about her mother? So tacky. But they would still like the photos she posted tomorrow. They would still comment with fire emojis and heart-eyed smileys. In Olivia's world, a public confession of cruelty could be spun into a brave act of authenticity. My own heart, which had felt like a block of ice in my chest, began to beat again. A slow, steady, heavy rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. The numbness was receding, and in its place something else was rising. It wasn't sadness. Sadness was a luxury I could no longer afford. It wasn't even anger, not the hot, explosive kind. It was something colder, harder. It was the feeling of a switch being flipped in a dark, silent room. It was the calm, quiet certainty of a final decision being made. She had called me a burden. She had said it with a smile, in a room I had bought while wearing a dress I had paid for, drinking champagne my money had provided. She had used my love, my grief, my generosity as a prop in her one-woman show. And in doing so, she hadn't just insulted me. She had given me a gift. The gift of clarity. The gift of permission. The permission to stop being the loving mother and to start being the woman Robert had married. A forensic accountant who could find a lie buried under a mountain of numbers. A woman who understood that every action has a consequence. A debt that must eventually be paid. I looked at her across the room, my daughter, the star of the show. She was glowing. She was triumphant. She was completely oblivious. She thought she had just defined me, a loving burden. But she was wrong. She had just sealed her own fate. She just didn't know it yet. I picked up my glass of water, the cool, heavy crystal, a comfort in my hand. And for the first time in 2 years, I took a slow, deliberate sip, the water washing away the ashes in my mouth. The party was just getting started. And so was I. My name is Emma Vance. I am 68 years old, a widow, and a woman who once understood the world through the clean, satisfying logic of numbers. For 40 years, I was a forensic accountant. I could make a balance sheet sing, revealing secrets hidden in the decimal points and forgotten ledgers. My life was ordered, predictable, and deeply rooted in the home my husband, Robert, and I had built together. It was a modest brick house on a street lined with oak trees, the kind of place where you measure time in the height of your children, marked on a doorframe. Every scuff on the hardwood floor told a story. Every crack in the plaster was a memory. It was the house where I brought my daughter, Olivia, home from the hospital, the house where the smell of baking bread and Robert's coffee filled the morning air. It was my sanctuary. When Robert passed away, the silence in that house became a physical weight. The rooms, once filled with his laughter and the energetic clutter of his projects, felt vast and empty. Olivia, ever practical, presented a solution that sounded like a life raft in my sea of grief. She and her husband, Mark, were looking to buy a brand new home in Austin, a sprawling mansion with a pool and a view of the hills. A place where they could entertain, build their lives, and she said, where I could have a beautiful suite of my own. "We'll be a family again, Mom," she'd said, her hand covering mine. "No more rattling around in that big old house alone. We'll take care of you. It just makes sense." And it did seem to make sense. I was lonely. The upkeep of the house was becoming a burden. The thought of being surrounded by family, of hearing the daily hum of life again, was intoxicating. So I did what any mother would do for her only child. I trusted her. I sold our family home, the repository of my entire adult life, and handed her the proceeds, over $1 million. It was everything Robert and I had ever worked for, poured into what she called the down payment on this very mansion. The deal was simple, she'd assured me, a handshake agreement between mother and daughter. I would live with them, and they would care for me for the rest of my days. I live in what used to be a storage room in the basement. There are no windows. The air is perpetually cool and carries the faint mineral scent of damp concrete and the metallic tang of the water heater that groans to life at all hours. My world is illuminated by a single bare bulb dangling from a cord, casting long, dancing shadows that make the space feel even smaller. My bed is a twin mattress on a simple metal frame, pushed against a wall of cinder blocks that are always cold to the touch. In the corner, a small chest of drawers holds my few possessions. This is my suite. From down here, the house above me is a world of sounds. I can hear the muffled cadence of their conversations, the bright bursts of laughter when they have guests, the scrape of chairs across the expensive tile in the kitchen. I hear the music they play, the television they watch, the heavy tread of Mark's shoes on the floorboards directly above my head. Sometimes I close my eyes and try to piece together their lives from these auditory scraps, like a blind woman trying to understand a photograph. They are living a vibrant, colorful existence in the sunlit rooms upstairs, an existence I funded but am not permitted to join. My pension, the modest but steady income I planned my quiet retirement around, is no longer my own. It's deposited directly into a joint account. "For household expenses, Mom," Olivia had explained, breezing through the paperwork one afternoon. "It's just easier to manage it all in one place. Now, if I need a few dollars to buy a new book or a skein of yarn, I have to ask. I have to explain the purchase, justify the expense, and wait for her to transfer a small amount to me. I, a woman who once managed multi-million-dollar accounts, must now ask my daughter for an allowance drawn from my own money. The humiliation is a quiet, constant burn. I am a ghost in the house I paid for. A silent benefactor relegated to the shadows, a footnote in the grand story of the life I made possible. Robert would have never allowed this. He was a brilliant man, a tech entrepreneur who saw the world not in emotions, but in code, contingencies, and firewalls. He was a builder of systems, both digital and financial. He was also secretive, a trait I sometimes found frustrating. "For your protection, Em," he'd say, a familiar refrain whenever I'd question the intricate web he was weaving around our assets. He'd be at his desk for hours, surrounded by monitors displaying lines of code and complex financial charts, building a fortress. I handled the day-to-day books, the simple arithmetic of our life, but he was the architect of the grand, impenetrable design. He structured our finances into a labyrinth of trusts and holding companies so complex that even I, with my accountant's mind, felt a sense of vertigo looking at the diagrams. I trusted him implicitly, even when I didn't understand. I knew his secrecy wasn't about hiding things from me, but about protecting me from a world he viewed as inherently predatory. As the illness took him, he grew quieter, his brilliant mind clouded by pain and medication. In his final days, in the sterile, beeping quiet of the hospital room, I held his hand, its familiar warmth fading. I watched his chest rise and fall, memorizing the shape of his face, bracing myself for the end. I expected his last words to be a final whispered, "I love you," a soft close to our 45-year-long story. But Robert was a systems man to the very end. He squeezed my hand, a flicker of his old strength returning. His eyes, hazy with morphine, focused on me with a sudden, startling clarity. He leaned closer, his voice a dry, urgent whisper, not of affection, but of instruction. "Em," he rasped, his breath catching. "Listen to me." I leaned in, my ear close to his lips, my heart aching. His last words to me were not, "I love you." They were a key, a final, fail-safe command planted in my memory. "Remember the contingency protocol," he whispered, the words precise despite his weakness. "Always, always have your own escape hatch." And then, he was gone. At the time, lost in the fog of my grief, the words felt strange, almost cruel, an algorithm instead of an endearment. But now, sitting on the edge of my bed in this cold, dark room, listening to the muffled sounds of a life I'm not part of, his final words echo, not as a strange farewell, but as a lifeline, a dormant piece of code waiting to be executed, an escape hatch, built by the man who loved me enough to plan for a future he would never see, a betrayal he must have somehow foreseen, a protocol for my protection. And for the first time in a long time, sitting in the heart of my cage, I feel a flicker not of despair, but of purpose. Robert had built me a fortress. It was time to find the door. My world had shrunk to the size of this room, a rectangle of concrete and damp air in the belly of the house I paid for. Upstairs, life happened in vibrant, echoing technicolor. I could hear it through the floorboards, a language of joy I was no longer fluent in. The clinking of heavy wine glasses, the deep, rumbling laughter of Mark's friends, the high-pitched squeal as Olivia unwrapped some expensive gift. Down here, life was grayscale. It was the hum of the old freezer in the corner and the slow, rhythmic drip of a pipe somewhere in the darkness behind the drywall. Dinner was a ritual of subtraction. It was never a meal prepared for me, but a collection of what was left over. I'd listen to the sounds of their feasting. I could almost smell the rosemary on the roasted lamb or the rich, buttery aroma of the seafood pasta they so loved to photograph. Olivia's voice would drift down, narrating for her phone. Another amazing family dinner with my favorite people. Mark just seared this Wagyu to perfection. So blessed. Then the tag, sharp as a needle. Had family dinner. An hour later, sometimes two, the basement door would creak open. Olivia wouldn't come down. She'd just place a plate on the top step, as if leaving food for a stray animal. My meal. Tonight, it was a sandwich. 2 slices of bread, stiff and dry at the edges. Between them, a single, translucent slice of processed ham and a smear of mustard that had already soaked into the bread, making it tragically sad and soggy. There was no glass of water, no napkin. This was my portion of the family's blessing. I would take the plate and retreat to my cot, the cold concrete seeping through the thin soles of my slippers. I ate slowly, mechanically, trying not to think about the Wagyu. Trying not to think about the word, family. The hunger in my stomach was a dull ache, but the hunger for a kind word, for a seat at the table, was a ravenous, hollow-jawed beast that gnawed at my insides. Some nights I'd use the old tablet Robert had given me, the one I kept hidden under my mattress, and I'd look at their life online. There they were, smiling in professionally lit photos. Olivia and Mark at a charity gala, their arms around each other. Olivia and Mark on a ski trip in Aspen, flushed and happy, and the food, endless pictures of food, truffle-dusted risotto, towers of fresh oysters, elaborate charcuterie boards that looked like Renaissance paintings. Each photo was a tiny, sharp-edged stone thrown at my heart. Each hashtag making memories, hashtag living our best life, was a confirmation of my invisibility. I was the ghost who paid the mortgage on their best life. The worst moments were not the neglect, but the casual cruelty. One afternoon, I was sitting on my cot, reading a paperback I'd managed to get from the library. The door opened without a knock. It was Mark. He stood there for a moment, his handsome face twisted into a mask of disgust. He sniffed the air dramatically. "Jesus, Liv," he called up the stairs, his voice loud enough for me to hear every syllable, loud enough to make sure I heard it. It's really starting to have that. You know, that old people smell down here. I froze. The book felt heavy in my hands. My own scent. He was talking about the smell of me, of my life, of my age, as if it were a contamination. I instinctively pulled my cardigan tighter around myself, trying to shrink, to disappear. Olivia's voice floated down, laced with amusement. "Oh, stop it. It's not that bad." "I'm serious," Mark said. He disappeared for a moment and came back with a can of Febreze. He didn't look at me. He didn't acknowledge my presence at all. I was just part of the offending scenery. And he began to spray, a wide, sweeping arc of sickly sweet linen sky scent. The chemical mist settled on my hair, on my book, on the thin blanket covering my legs. It was cloying, suffocating. I wanted to cough, but my throat had closed up tight. I just sat there, a statue being disinfected, while the man who lived in my house, who ate the food bought with my money, tried to erase my existence with a cheap aerosol can. And then I heard it. From the top of the stairs. A laugh. It wasn't a small chuckle. It was a full, throaty laugh from Olivia. The sound of her amusement at my humiliation was worse than the chemical spray, worse than the cold sandwich, worse than the loneliness. It was the sound of a final door slamming shut, locking me in the dark. I didn't cry. The tears were frozen somewhere deep inside me, a glacier of unshed grief. I simply sat there breathing in the artificial sky and felt another piece of myself turn to dust. The whiplash from their cruelty to their performance was a constant, disorienting assault. Olivia's identity, her entire sense of self-worth, was woven into the digital tapestry of her social media presence. Her magnum opus, the series that garnered her thousands of followers and fawning comments, was a masterpiece of fiction titled Caring for an Aging Parent. A filming day always began the same way. The basement door would open and light would spill down the stairs. But instead of a plate left on the step, Olivia would descend, her phone already mounted on a small spidery tripod she carried everywhere. Her face would be soft, her voice a gentle honeyed whisper. "Mom?" she'd say, as if waking a sleeping baby. "You awake, sweetie? I brought you a nice cup of chamomile tea. I thought we could have a chat." The tea was always a prop. It was lukewarm, the tea bag still floating limply in the mug. She wasn't bringing me tea. She was bringing the camera an opportunity. She would fuss around me, her movements practiced and graceful for her audience of strangers. She'd fluff my one lumpy pillow, making a show of it. She'd smooth the threadbare blanket over my knees, her touch feather light and utterly devoid of warmth. "Just sit up a little straighter, Mom. There you go," she'd murmur, positioning me in the frame. "Let's get that nice bit of light from the single bulb on you." She'd press record, and the transformation was instantaneous. Her eyes would become liquid pools of empathy. A sad, brave little smile would play on her lips. She'd hand me the mug, making sure her perfectly manicured hands were in the shot. Then she would speak to the lens, to her adoring public. "It's so rewarding, you know," she'd begin, her voice catching with just the right amount of emotion. "But it's so challenging. Some days are harder than others." She'd reach out and pat my hand, a gesture that felt like a spider crawling on my skin. "But she's my mom." And then I would do anything for her, absolutely anything. A single, perfect tear would well in the corner of her eye and trace a glistening path down her cheek. It was a remarkable performance. She was Meryl Streep in a damp basement. I learned my role was to be silent, to look frail and grateful. I would hold the mug and stare into the middle distance, a perfect portrait of venerable decline. The moment she hit the stop button, the actress vanished. The soft face hardened into a mask of impatience. The gentle smile evaporated. She'd snatch the mug from my hand. "God, Mom," she'd hiss, her voice sharp and cold. "You almost ruined the take. You looked like you were about to actually start crying. It's too much. It makes people uncomfortable." She'd scroll through her phone, her brow furrowed in concentration. "It's hurting my engagement. People want to feel inspired by my struggle, not depressed by your face." Try to look less miserable next time, okay? Think peaceful. Think beatific. She'd turn and walk up the stairs, taking the prop tee with her, leaving me in the abrupt silence, the ghost of her performance still hanging in the air. I was not her mother. I was her supporting cast, and I was failing at my one job, to make her look good. Some days, the production moved outdoors. "We're getting some fresh air today," she'd announced to her followers in a chipper, sing-song voice, her phone already recording as she helped me up the steep basement stairs. The fresh air consisted of a carefully curated 10-minute photo shoot in a remote corner of the backyard. She'd choose a spot with good lighting, usually by the rose bushes I had insisted on planting years ago. She'd position me on a wrought iron bench. "Chin up a little. Look towards the garden. No, not at the weeds. Look at the one good rose. Look thoughtful, grateful." She'd snap a dozen photos from different angles. Then, she would get in the shot with me, her arm draped around my shoulders, her head resting gently against mine. Her hair always smelled of expensive shampoo. Her embrace felt like a cage. "Okay, I think I got it," she'd say, instantly pulling away to examine the screen. Her thumb would fly across the glass. "This one's good. The lighting makes you look ethereal." The word hung in the air between us. Ethereal. Like I was already half gone. The photo shoot would end as abruptly as it began. "All right, you can go back inside now," she'd say, her attention already consumed by filters and captions. "I'm meeting the girls for brunch." And I would make my slow, solitary way back to the basement, the brief illusion of freedom dissolving as the door closed behind me, plunging me back into the familiar dimness. I was a prop, taken out for a scene, and then put back in my box until I was needed again. The transition from prop to tool was seamless. It happened on a Tuesday. I remember the quality of the light upstairs was different. It was the flat, unforgiving light of the kitchen, not the soft, curated glow of Olivia's TikToks. She had called me up from the basement, her voice lacking its usual performative sweetness. It was clipped, efficient. "Mom, we need you for a minute." In the kitchen. The summons felt ominous. When I reached the top of the stairs, blinking in the brightness, I saw them. Olivia and Mark, standing on the other side of the vast granite island. They were a team, a united front. Between them lay a thick stack of papers, crisp and official. A pen was placed precisely next to it. They had me sit on one of the tall, modern bar stools. My feet dangled, not quite touching the floor. It was a power play, designed to make me feel small and precarious. I felt like a child called into the principal's office. Mark leaned forward, resting his hands on the cool stone. He smiled, but it was a predator's smile, all teeth and no warmth. His tone was slick, condescending, the one a person uses to explain something very simple to someone they believe to be very stupid. "We're refinancing the house, Mom," he said. The "we" was a deliberate wall, separating them from me. "The rates are fantastic right now. It's just a formality, really, a smart financial move." Olivia picked up the expensive-looking fountain pen and pushed it towards me. Her red nails were a splash of blood against the white paper. "Don't you worry your pretty little head about the details, Mom," she cooed, her voice a grotesque parody of her online persona. "It's just boring bank stuff. We just need your signature. Here." She tapped a finger on a yellow sticky tab. "And here." My hand trembled as I reached for the pen. I could feel the weight of their combined stare, the sheer force of their expectation. For years, my mind had been the sharpest thing about me. I was a forensic accountant. I had untangled financial knots more complex than anything these two could ever conceive of. The irony was a physical pain in my chest. My voice, when it came out, was thin and reedy, a stranger's voice. What does a refinance entail exactly?" It was a test. A small, final attempt to be seen as a person with a functioning brain. The reaction was instantaneous and volcanic. Olivia threw her head back and let out a long, theatrical sigh, a sound of pure, unadulterated exasperation. The mask of the caring daughter didn't just slip, it shattered. "Oh my God, Mom!" she snapped, her voice high and shrill. "Seriously? Can you just sign the papers? Do you have to make everything so difficult?" Every single thing is a production with you." The accusation hung in the air, thick and suffocating as the Febreze in my basement room. Difficult. I was being difficult. By asking a single question about a legal document that would fundamentally alter the ownership of a house purchased with every last cent I had in the world. Mark crossed his arms, his jaw tight with annoyance. He looked at Olivia as if to say, "See? I told you this would be a pain." In their eyes, I wasn't a mother, a partner in this home, or even a human being with rights. I was an obstacle, a frustrating, inconvenient problem to be managed. The pen felt cold and heavy in my fingers. I looked from Olivia's furious face to Mark's impatient one. I looked at the signature line, a black void waiting to swallow the last of my autonomy. And I looked at the papers, a legal testament to my own erasure, the 1,000 daily cuts, the cold leftovers, the staged videos, the chemical spray, the casual cruelty, had all been leading to this single, mortal wound. They weren't just neglecting me anymore. They were actively trying to strip me of everything. I held the pen, the silence in the bright, sterile kitchen stretching into an eternity. And in that moment, a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years ignited deep within the cold ashes of my despair. It wasn't hope. It was the cold, hard glint of steel. The accountant in me, the woman Robert had trusted, the person I used to be, was beginning to wake up. My one escape, my only breath of clean air, was the weekly trip to the public library. Olivia would drop me off with a patronizing little pat on the shoulder, a saccharine smile plastered on for any onlookers. "Have fun with your books, Mom," she'd say, her voice loud enough for the librarian at the front desk to hear. "Don't get into too much trouble with those handsome cowboys in your romance novels." She thought it was a joke. She thought I was a doddering old woman, content to lose myself in tales of fabricated passion. She had no idea the library was my war room. The musty smell of old paper and bookbinding glue was the scent of freedom. The gentle, rhythmic hum of the fluorescent lights and the hushed clicks of computer mice were the sounds of a brewing rebellion. I never went to the fiction aisles. My destination was always the same, a row of public-use computers in the back corner, tucked away behind shelves of outdated encyclopedias. The monitors were old, the keyboards sticky with the residue of 1,000 strangers' hands, but they were a sanctuary. They were computers Olivia couldn't monitor, a digital space she couldn't control. For an hour and a half every Tuesday, I wasn't her loving burden. I was Emma Vance, forensic accountant, a ghost in the machine. For months, I'd just been practicing, refamiliarizing myself with the digital world I'd once navigated with ease. But today was different. Today was the anniversary of Robert's death. A day Olivia marked with a single perfunctory text message. "Thinking of Dad today. Hope you're okay." The heart emoji felt like a shard of glass. I sat down at my usual terminal, my hands trembling slightly as I typed in the login credentials for an old encrypted email account. It was an account Robert had set up for me years ago, a digital fortress he'd built with his typical, meticulous foresight. "Just in case, Em," he'd said, his hand covering mine on the mouse. "A private line. Always have your own private line." I hadn't accessed it since his funeral. I hadn't needed to. Until now. The inbox loaded with agonizing slowness. It was mostly junk, digital cobwebs from a life I no longer lived. And then I saw it. An unread email. My breath caught in my throat. The sender was David Chen, Robert's lifelong friend, his college roommate, his first business partner, and the executor of his will. He was more of a brother to Robert than a friend. The subject line was stark, clinical, and sent a jolt through my system like a defibrillator. "Robert Vance, Contingency Protocol, Annual Activation Query." My heart hammered against my ribs. The contingency protocol. Robert's final words to me hadn't been a whispered, "I love you." He was too pragmatic for that, even at the end. His eyes, cloudy with medication but still sharp, had locked onto mine. He'd squeezed my hand, a weak but insistent pressure. "Remember the contingency protocol," he had rasped, his voice a ghost of its former strength. "The final failsafe. Always have your own exit hatch, Em. Always." The email had arrived every year on this exact date, a silent digital question mark, waiting. For 5 years, I had seen the notification on my phone and ignored it, archiving it without a second thought. I was grieving. I was trying to build a new life with my daughter. I was a fool. I had trusted. This was the first year I was desperate enough, brave enough, to click it open. The body of the email was as concise as the subject line. Emma, this is the annual automated query as per Robert's instructions. If you are receiving this and require activation of the protocol, please respond with the activation phrase, "The cardinal flies at dawn." If no response is received, the query will be sent again in 1 year. I hope you are well. Sincerely, David Chen. The cardinal flies at dawn. It was a silly phrase they'd concocted in college, a code for when they were skipping a boring lecture to go fishing. To see it here, now, felt like a message from Robert himself, a hand reaching out from the past. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. For a moment, a wave of guilt washed over me. This felt like a betrayal of my daughter, of the family I was supposed to be a part of. But then the image of Olivia's face at the party, that smug, pitying smile as she called me her burden, flashed in my mind. The damp chill of the basement room seeped into my bones, even here in the warm library. The taste of leftover casserole, cold and congealed, was on my tongue. The guilt evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I typed the words, "The cardinal flies at dawn," and I hit send. A moment later, a new email appeared. It was from David, a direct reply. "Awaiting your call. My personal cell is phone number. Call me as soon as you can. Destroy this email. DC." My hands were shaking so badly I could barely control the mouse. I printed the email, then followed the instructions, deleting it from the inbox, the sent folder, and the trash folder, then clearing the browser history. The piece of paper felt warm from the printer, a tangible piece of hope. I folded it carefully and tucked it deep inside my bra, the only place I knew Olivia would never look. Leaving the library, the Austin air, usually thick with heat and humidity, felt crisp and clean. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. The first step was taken. The protocol was active. Back in my basement room, the oppressive silence felt different. It was no longer the silence of resignation. It was the silence of a hunter waiting in a blind. I pulled out the cheap, prepaid phone Olivia had given me for emergencies. She'd made a big show of it. "So you can always reach me, Mom, and I can always reach you." I knew it was just another tool of control. I dialed the number from the printout, my thumb pressing the numbers with deliberate care. The call didn't ring. A synthesized female voice, cold and impersonal, chirped in my ear. "The number you have dialed has been restricted. Please contact your account administrator." Confusion turned to ice in my stomach. Restricted? I tried again. Same message. I navigated the phone's clunky menu system, my blood running cold as I found the settings. There was a list, blocked numbers. My finger trembled as I scrolled down. David Chen, my breath hitched. I kept scrolling. Susan Miller. My best friend from my old neighborhood book club. Martha Riley. My cousin from Arizona, the one who sent me photos of her grandkids every week. Dr. Evans. My old family doctor. The list went on. A dozen names. My friends. My family. My entire support system. She hadn't just moved me into her basement. She had systematically, methodically, severed every line of communication I had to the outside world. She had built a digital wall around my prison cell. The phone wasn't for my safety. It was a leash, designed to give me the illusion of freedom while ensuring I could only call her or Mark. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It wasn't a spontaneous act of selfishness. It was a calculated, long-term plan. A hot, useless rage filled me, followed by a chilling clarity. This was a game, and I was dangerously behind. I couldn't use this phone. I couldn't use their internet. I was completely cut off. But Robert had taught me more than just about contingency protocols. He'd taught me about squirreling away resources. For the past 6 months, every time Olivia gave me cash for groceries, a task she assigned me to make herself feel magnanimous, I had skimmed. $1 here, 50 cents there. It was a pathetic little act of defiance, a way to feel like I had something that was my own. It wasn't much, but I had managed to save a little over $100, hidden away in an old jewelry box filled with costume pearls. The next day, I told Olivia I felt a cold coming on and needed to walk to the CVS to get some cough drops. It was a risk. She hated when I left the house unscheduled, but she was busy planning a weekend getaway with Mark, distracted by hotel bookings and restaurant reservations. "Fine, Mom, whatever," she said, not even looking up from her laptop. "Just be back in an hour, and don't talk to any strangers." The irony was a bitter pill. I didn't go to CVS. I walked 3 blocks in the opposite direction, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. I felt like a spy in my own life. I walked into a 7-Eleven, the bell above the door chiming my arrival. The air smelled of stale coffee and hot dogs. I bought a burner phone and a prepaid card with the cash I'd saved. The transaction was anonymous, untraceable. The phone itself was a cheap piece of plastic, a world away from the sleek devices Olivia and Mark carried, but as I held it in my hand, it felt like a weapon. It felt like power. Back in my room, I peeled off the plastic, inserted the SIM card, and dialed David's number again. This time, there was no synthesized voice, just the sound of a phone ringing. It went through on the first ring. David Chen speaking. His voice was exactly as I remembered it, deep, calm, steady. A lighthouse in a storm. "David," I breathed, my own voice a rusty whisper. "It's Emma." Emma Vance. There was a pause on the other end, then a sharp intake of breath. "Emma, my God, I got your message. I've been waiting for this call for 5 years. Are you all right? Where are you?" I'm in a difficult situation, David." The understatement of the century. Tears I didn't know I was holding back began to well in my eyes. Robert was right. He was right about everything. "I know, Emma. I know," he said, his voice laced with a grim sympathy. "Listen to me. We need to meet, in person. Can you get to my office tomorrow? Say 10 a.m.? "I'll find a way," I said, a new strength hardening my voice. "I'll be there." "Good. Be careful, Emma. You're dealing with more than you know." He was right. I was about to find out just how much more. The next morning, I told Olivia I had a follow-up appointment for a dental cleaning I'd forgotten about. The lie came more easily this time. She grumbled, annoyed at the disruption to her schedule, but she needed to go into the city for a very important influencer brunch. So she dropped me off at the dental clinic, telling me to call her when I was done. The moment her car turned the corner, I walked to the nearest bus stop and took a cross-town bus to David's office downtown. His office was on the 14th floor of an old, distinguished-looking building. Unlike Olivia's minimalist, white-on-white mansion that felt like a sterile art gallery, David's space was a sanctuary of warmth and history. The walls were lined with dark wood shelves overflowing with books, law books, history books, novels. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and freshly brewed coffee. It smelled of stability. It smelled of Robert. David came from behind a large mahogany desk to greet me. He was older now, his hair more silver than black, but his eyes were the same, kind, intelligent, and serious. He wrapped me in a hug that felt solid and real, the first genuine human touch I'd felt in what seemed like a lifetime. "Emma," he said, pulling back to look at me, his face etched with concern. "It's so good to see you, but my God, you look tired." "Tired doesn't begin to cover it, David," I said, sinking into one of the plush leather chairs in front of his desk. He sat opposite me, his expression grim. "Robert predicted this," he began, his voice low. "He saw the seeds of it years ago. He knew Olivia's character, her ambition, her sense of entitlement. He hoped he was wrong, but he never operated on hope alone." He leaned forward, folding his hands on the polished desk. "Emma, we need to be very clear about the facts, because the facts are your only weapon right now. First, the house. The $1 million you gave Olivia after Robert died." "I sold our home," I whispered. "I gave her everything." "No," David corrected gently but firmly. "You didn't give her anything. That's the story she tells herself. And the world. The reality is far different. Robert and I structured it very carefully. The money from the sale of your house was not a gift. It was a documented capital injection into a legal entity. He slid a thick, leather-bound folder across the desk towards me. The gold lettering on the front read, "The Emma Vance Benevolent Trust." I stared at the words, uncomprehending. The what? The house in Austin was never purchased in Olivia's name, David explained, tapping a finger on the folder. It is, and always has been, owned entirely by this trust. A trust established by Robert for one purpose and one purpose only, to ensure your lifelong care and well-being. I opened the folder. Inside were pages and pages of dense legal documents filled with clauses and subclauses. It was overwhelming. David pointed to a highlighted section. This is the crucial part. Olivia is not the owner. She is legally designated as the resident manager of the property. Her right to live in that house, free of charge, is entirely conditional on one unbreakable clause. He slid a pair of reading glasses on and read directly from the page. The resident manager's position is contingent upon providing the primary beneficiary, Emma Vance, with dignified, respectful, and loving care, consistent with the standards of a cherished family member. Dignified, respectful, loving. The words were a mockery. They hung in the air of the quiet office, starkly contrasted against the reality of my basement room, the cold leftovers, the public humiliation. A wave of relief so powerful it almost made me dizzy, washed over me. The house was mine. The foundation she had built her lavish life upon was mine. But the look on David's face stopped my celebration before it could begin. "There's bad news, Emma," he said, and the warmth in the room seemed to cool by several degrees. "They know about the trust, or at least they suspect something isn't right, and they've hired a shark, a lawyer named Rex Morgan. He's one of the most ruthless probate litigators in the state." My stomach clenched. "A lawyer? Why?" "He's filed a motion to challenge the trust's validity," David said, his voice grave. "He's planning to argue that at the time the trust was created and funded, you were not of sound mind. His claim is that you were mentally incompetent, reeling from the grief of Robert's death, and that Olivia, as your loving daughter, was merely managing the funds on your behalf out of necessity." Mentally incompetent. The word struck me like a physical blow. It was the ultimate insult, the final erasure. First, they had taken my home, my money, my friends. Now they were trying to take my mind, to rewrite history and paint me as a confused old woman who couldn't be trusted with her own life. "But that's a lie," I stammered. "I was grieving, yes, but I was perfectly lucid. You were there, David. You know I was." "I know," he said, "and I will testify to that. But Morgan is very, very good at twisting perception. He will paint a picture of a distraught widow, easily manipulated, and he has something, Emma, a piece of evidence that he believes is his silver bullet." He reached into the folder again and pulled out a single sheet of paper encased in a plastic sleeve. He slid it across the desk. "This was filed with the court last week." I picked it up. It was a power of attorney document. It looked official, with a notary's seal at the bottom and a date from 5 years ago, just a few months after Robert passed away. It granted Olivia an almost absolute power over all my affairs, financial, medical, and legal. It effectively made me her ward, and at the bottom, on the signature line, was my name, Emma Vance. "I never signed this," I said, my voice flat. "I would never, ever sign something like this." I looked closer. The signature was perfect. It was my handwriting, my exact flourish on the V, the precise loop on the E. It was flawless, and it was a complete and utter fraud. How could she have replicated it so perfectly? And then, a memory, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, surfaced from the depths of my mind. It washed over me with a dread so profound it felt like I was drowning. Olivia. She must have been 16. She was sitting at the kitchen table, a crumpled school permission slip in front of her, trying to forge my signature so she could go on a ski trip I had forbidden. She was terrible at it. Her attempts were clumsy, childish. I remember being in a hurry, late for a client meeting, annoyed by the whole drama. I just wanted it to be over. No, that's all wrong, I had said, taking the pen from her hand. I remember the foolish, impatient thought. It's faster if I just show her. You're making the E too tight. You have to loop the E like this, see? Give it some air to breathe, and the V needs to be sharp, not rounded. I had taken her hand, guided her fingers, showing her the exact pressure, the specific angle. I had taught her. In a moment of maternal impatience, I had handed my own child the master key to my entire life. I looked up from the forged document, the plastic sleeve cold against my fingertips. I met David's eyes, and he must have seen the dawning horror on my face. Emma, what is it? I couldn't speak. The realization was a physical weight, crushing the air from my lungs. The lawyer, the challenge to my sanity, it was all built on this. A document I never signed, a signature I had taught my own daughter to forge. My own mistake, a stupid, careless lesson from more than a decade ago, was now the weapon being sharpened to destroy me completely. This wasn't just Olivia's betrayal. In a way, it was my own. I had built the cage, and she had just locked the door. The phone call with David echoed in the hollow space where my heart used to be. It wasn't a comfort, not yet. It was a weapon. And as I returned to that cold, beautiful house, a house I had paid for in more ways than one, I knew I had to learn how to wield it. The first step was not to attack, but to disappear. To become the person they already thought I was. The frail, confused, burdensome old woman. I went from being a prisoner in my own home to being a ghost. And a ghost, I was learning, had its own kind of power. My life became a stage, the basement my dressing room, and I was preparing for the performance of a lifetime. A few days later, Olivia approached me. She didn't come down to the basement, of course. She never did. She sent Mark to fetch me, as if I were a piece of furniture to be moved. I made my ascent up the stairs deliberately slow, my hand trembling on the railing, my breath coming in shallow, staged pants. By the time I reached the gleaming marble of the main floor, I looked suitably depleted. They had set up a small card table in the living room, away from their pristine white sofas. It was an island of condescension. Olivia sat there, a tight, impatient smile plastered on her face, a stack of papers arranged neatly before her. Mark stood behind her, his arms crossed, a human wall of intimidation. "Mom, we need to get this done," Olivia said, her voice dripping with the false sweetness she used for her TikTok videos. "It's just the refinancing paperwork. We talked about this." I peered at the documents, letting my eyes go unfocused. Refinancing? Oh, I thought we already did that. I let a sliver of confusion cloud my voice. Mark sighed, a sound of pure exasperation. "No, Emma. That was the initial mortgage. This is to get a better rate." "It saves us money." "Saves us money," I repeated softly, as if the concept was a foreign language. "Oh, that's good." I reached for the pen she offered, my hand shaking. They exchanged a look. It was a flash of triumphant pity. They believed it. They truly believed I was crumbling. I leaned over the papers, squinting. "The numbers are so small, dear. What does this part say? The interest rate." I tapped a random paragraph. I knew exactly what it said. I had spent 40 years reading financial documents far more complex than this. Olivia's patience snapped. "It doesn't matter, Mom. It's a standard contract. Just sign on the line." She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the signature field. "Of course, dear. Of course." I picked up the glass of water they had placed on the table for me. My hand jerked, a carefully orchestrated spasm. Water sloshed over the edge, a perfect arc that soaked the entire signature page. The ink on the printed lines began to bleed. Oh my goodness," I cried, dabbing at the puddle with my sleeve, making it worse. "I'm so sorry. I'm just so clumsy these days." Olivia shot up from her chair, her face a mask of fury. "For God's sake, Mom," she hissed, snatching the wet papers away as if they were contaminated. "Can't you do anything right?" Mark put a hand on her shoulder. "Liv, calm down," he said, but his eyes on me were like chips of ice. "It was an accident." He looked at me. "We'll print them again tomorrow, Emma. Maybe you'll be feeling clearer." I gave him a wavering, apologetic smile. "Yes, Tomorrow. My head is just so fuzzy today. I think I need to lie down. I didn't wait for a dismissal. I turned and shuffled back towards the basement stairs, feeling their eyes burning into my back. I didn't let the mask slip until the door to my damp room was closed. Down in the dark, I allowed myself a small, grim smile. The first scene was over. They had taken the bait. My decline was not just believable, it was a relief to them. It made their plans easier. The next day, they tried again. This time, Mark took the lead. He adopted a tone of painstaking gentleness, the kind one might use with a very slow child. He sat beside me, explaining each section of the new, dry set of papers. "See, Emma? This just gives the bank permission to adjust our loan. It's all for the best," he said, his voice a low, condescending murmur. "Our loan," I murmured, looking out the window. "It's such a big house for just the three of us." "And it's expensive to maintain," he countered smoothly. "This helps. It helps you too. It means we can keep taking care of you, right here." The lie was so bald, so audacious, it almost took my breath away. Taking care of me. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach, but I kept my face placid, my expression vaguely confused. "I'm just so tired, Mark," I whispered, my voice thin and reedy. "All these numbers. My head hurts." I know, he soothed. "Just one little signature, and it's all over. Then you can rest. Here." He placed the pen in my hand again, his fingers guiding mine to the correct line. I let him position my fingers. I lowered the pen to the paper. The tip hovered just above the line. I could feel their collective breath being held. Olivia was watching from the kitchen doorway, her body rigid with anticipation. I took a deep, theatrical breath, as if summoning my last ounce of strength. And then, I let my head loll to the side, my eyes closing. My hand went limp, and the pen clattered onto the table. I began to snore softly, a pathetic, rattling sound I'd practiced in my room. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with their frustration. I could feel it pressing down on me. "Unbelievable," Olivia finally spat out, her voice a venomous whisper. "She's just a dead weight. The lawyer said we need her signature while she's still legally competent," Mark whispered back, his voice tight. "If we wait too long, we'll have to go through the courts to get guardianship, and that could take months. We don't have months." "So what do we do?" Olivia demanded. "Keep trying until she accidentally stays awake long enough to sign?" "We just have to be patient," Mark said, though he sounded anything but. "Her mind is going. One of these days, she'll sign without even knowing what it is. Just keep her calm. Keep up the act." Keep up the act. The irony was a bitter pill. They thought they were the actors in this drama, manipulating a fading mind. They had no idea they were merely props in mine. I continued my performance, a slow, draining symphony of decay. I would forget their names. I would ask what day it was half a dozen times. I would try to help with dinner and end up dropping a plate. Each mistake, each sign of my supposed frailty, was a carefully placed stone on the path to their ruin. Their frustration mounted. Their disdain became more open, their words sharper. They stopped seeing me as a person at all, but as an inconvenient, malfunctioning appliance. And in their contempt, I found my cover. I was not declining. I was plotting. The opportunity I was waiting for arrived dressed in sequins and a tuxedo. It was the annual Austin Innovators Gala, the crown jewel of the city's social calendar. For Olivia and Mark, it was a command performance, a crucial night for networking and reinforcing their brand as a power couple. I watched them prepare, a whirlwind of hairspray, cologne, and frantic self-admiration in front of the hall mirror. "Do I look like a seven-figure brand?" Olivia asked, turning for Mark's inspection. Her dress was a column of shimmering gold, so tight it looked painful. "You look like $1 billion, he replied, straightening his bow tie. He caught my eye in the mirror. I was sitting quietly on the bottom stair, watching them. "Now, Emma," he said, his voice taking on that familiar, patronizing tone. "We're going to be out late. The leftover lasagna is in the fridge. Don't try to use the stove. Just use the microwave. Can you handle that? I nodded slowly, my eyes wide and vacant. Lasagna. Okay, Mark. You and Olivia have fun at the party. It's a gala, Mom, Olivia corrected, her voice sharp with irritation. She didn't even look at me. Try not to burn the house down. They swept out the door in a cloud of expensive perfume, the lock clicking shut with a definitive sound of freedom. Theirs, not mine. The house fell silent. For them, the night was just beginning. For me, the real work was about to start. I didn't go to the kitchen. I went straight to Mark's home office. It was his sanctuary, the one room Olivia rarely entered. The door was, of course, unlocked. Arrogance is a poor security system. The room was just as I remembered from the few times I'd been ordered to dust it, cold, minimalist, and smelling faintly of leather and self-importance. A massive desk dominated the space, a sleek, powerful computer sitting on it like a throne. I sat in his ridiculously expensive ergonomic chair. It felt like sitting in the cockpit of an enemy warship. For a moment, I just breathed. The skills I was about to call upon felt like ghosts from another life. 40 years I'd spent as a forensic accountant, chasing phantom numbers, finding truth in spreadsheets, and unraveling lies hidden in decimal points. My husband Robert used to call me his secret weapon. Since his death, that part of me had been packed away, gathering dust like my old professional awards stored in a box in the basement. But now, my fingers found the keyboard, and it was like they had a memory of their own. The screen lit up, asking for a password. My mind raced. What would a man like Mark, a man whose entire identity was built on a pedestal of ego, choose to protect his digital kingdom? It wouldn't be his daughter's birthday. It wouldn't be his anniversary. It would be about him. His success. His status. I typed. TOPPRODUCER1. I hit enter. The screen flickered and unlocked. Access granted. A cold smile touched my lips. He was as predictable as he was arrogant. Within minutes, I was no longer Emma Vance, the frail old woman. I was the silent accountant again. My mind, which I had so convincingly portrayed as foggy and slow, became a razor. I moved through his digital life with a speed and precision that felt like a homecoming. I bypassed the surface-level folders, clients, contracts, marketing, and went for the heart of it all, the finances. It didn't take long to see the truth. The image they projected to the world was a house of cards. They weren't just over-leveraged, they were drowning. I opened the credit card statements first. American Express Platinum, Visa Black, thousands upon thousands of dollars spent every month. Gucci, Prada, 5-star hotels in Miami, dinners at restaurants where a single steak cost more than my entire monthly allowance. It was a performance of wealth, funded by a deep, dark well of debt. Then I found the loans, not just the mortgage. There were high-interest personal loans from shady online lenders, the digital equivalent of a back-alley loan shark. There were 2 car loans for vehicles that cost more than the down payment I had given them for this house. They were bleeding money from every possible angle, desperately trying to keep the influencer fantasy alive. The refinancing plan wasn't about getting a better rate. It was a life raft, a desperate cash out to get one last massive injection of funds before the whole enterprise collapsed. And what was their plan after that? The answer lay in Mark's search history. My fingers trembled slightly as I typed the keywords into the search bar for his email archive. Dubai, international relocation, expat banking, and there it was, a detailed plan. Emails between him and a relocation specialist in the United Arab Emirates. They were planning to liquidate everything. The loan from the house was the key. It was their escape fund. They would take the money, transfer it to an offshore account, and disappear. A cold dread, colder than the basement floor, crept over me. What about me? Where did I fit into this grand escape plan? I changed my search term. My fingers hovered over the keys for a second, a wave of nausea washing over me. I typed, nursing home. The results came up instantly. An email chain between Olivia and Mark from 3 weeks ago. The subject line was the E problem. E, that's what I was to them. A problem. My eyes scanned Olivia's words. We need the cheapest possible option. State-run. It has to be clean enough that it won't raise red flags if anyone from social services checks, but that's it. We can't afford more than a few hundred a month for her upkeep. Mark's reply was even more brutal. I found a few options outside Austin, far enough away that we won't have to visit. Once she's signed the papers and the money is in our account, we can have her moved within a week. We'll tell her it's a long-term care resort. She's so out of it, she'll probably believe it. By the time she figures it out, we'll be on a plane to Dubai. I leaned back in the chair, the leather creaking in the silent room. The screen glowed, illuminating the words that confirmed my complete and utter disposability. I was not their mother. I was a final asset to be squeezed dry, an obstacle to be discarded in the cheapest, most convenient way possible. The betrayal was so absolute, so profound, it went beyond pain. It settled into something hard and heavy in my chest, something resolute. They weren't just going to put me in a home, they were going to erase me, leave me to die among strangers in a place chosen for its rock-bottom price, while they lived in luxury on my money, on Robert's money. My husband's final words came back to me, not as a memory, but as a command. Always have an escape hatch of your own. He knew. Somehow he must have known the weakness, the selfishness that lay dormant in our daughter. My hands were steady now. The shock had burned away, leaving behind a cold, clear purpose. I knew their plan, but I needed more. I needed the mechanism, the legal tool they intended to use against me. The how. My instincts told me the refinancing papers weren't the only weapon in their arsenal. If my performance of senility continued, a simple signature might become impossible. They would need a contingency. They would need a way to sign for me. My eyes scanned the desktop icons. Most were standard applications and folders. But one stood out, a cloud storage drive. It was labeled simply, Creative. An odd name for a man like Mark, who had all the creativity of a block of concrete. I double-clicked. Inside were folders of Olivia's social media content, organized by month. Video clips, photo shoots, branding guides. It was a monument to her narcissism. I ignored them. I was looking for something else, something older, more personal. My forensic accounting experience had taught me that people often hide the most incriminating things in plain sight under the most innocuous of labels. I found a folder deep inside the directory. It was labeled Old Art. My breath caught in my throat. Olivia had loved to draw as a child. I had encouraged it, bought her sketchbooks and expensive pencils. It was one of our things. My heart ached with the memory of it, a sharp, sudden pang. I clicked on the folder. It wasn't filled with childish drawings of flowers and horses. It was filled with dozens, perhaps hundreds, of image files from a digital drawing tablet. I opened the first one. It was my signature, Emma Vance. A bit shaky, the E not quite right. I opened the next file, my signature again. This time, the loop on the V was more fluid. The next one was closer still. The date stamps on the files told a horrifying story. They started 5 years ago, shortly after Robert passed away. She had been planning this for years, practicing, honing her craft. I scrolled through the files, a timeline of her deception. From clumsy forgeries to, finally, the most recent files, dated only last week. I opened one. It was perfect, indistinguishable from my own. The pressure of the pen, the slight upward tilt at the end of the E, a tiny quirk she had noticed and replicated flawlessly. I felt a wave of dizziness. This wasn't just fraud. This was a violation of the deepest, most intimate kind. She had studied me, not as a daughter studies a mother, but as a predator studies its prey, learning every detail to facilitate the kill. I remembered, with a sickening lurch, a moment from her teenage years. She had forgotten a permission slip for a school trip and was in a panic. I was at work. To calm her down, I had walked her through how to copy my signature over the phone, laughing as I told her, just this once for an emergency. A moment of mother-daughter conspiracy, of shared trust. She had taken that lesson, that moment of intimacy, and twisted it into this monstrous weapon. My grief hardened into something else, something cold and sharp. I had the what and the how. Now, I needed the final confirmation. The indisputable proof of intent. I went back to the email server. This time, I didn't search for keywords. I just started reading their exchanges, going back months. It was a sickening journey through their shared contempt for me. I was the burden, the situation in the basement, the old hag. The words blurred through a film of tears I refused to let fall. And then I found it. The smoking gun. An email from Mark to Olivia, sent 2 nights ago after my accidental spilling of the water. The subject, Plan B. The message was short and brutal. Liv, this isn't working. She's getting more difficult. We need to move on the power of attorney. Get the old hag to sign it. Tell her it's for her medical care. If she won't, just do it yourself. You've practiced enough. Once we have that, we don't need her signature on the loan docs. We can sign for her. Once the money is in the bank, she's not our problem anymore. We'll be free. There it was. Not just a plan to abandon me, but a conspiracy to commit felony fraud and forgery to steal my entire net worth, to steal the home Robert and I had built our lives to afford. My hands moved with a new, chilling efficiency. I found a new, encrypted flash drive David had instructed me to buy during our call. I plugged it into the USB port. The download began. Every email, every financial statement, every single damning practice signature from the old art folder. The progress bar on the screen was a slow-moving river, carrying all of their lies and betrayals to a place of safety. To my place of power. The house was still. The only sound was the quiet hum of the computer and the frantic beating of my own heart. I listened for the sound of a car in the driveway, my body tensed for a fight I wasn't yet ready for. But they were still out, celebrating their bright future, completely oblivious to the fact that their past was being meticulously documented in the room down the hall. When the download finished, I ejected the drive and clutched it in my hand. It was small and cold, but it felt as heavy as a gravestone. I wiped the computer's recent activity, cleared the search history, and covered my tracks with the practiced ease of a professional. I left the office exactly as I had found it. I went downstairs, my steps no longer shuffling. They were firm, resolved. I sat in the dark of my basement room, the flash drive in my pocket, and waited for them to come home. I had heard every word. I had seen every number. I had uncovered every lie. The silent accountant had finally, definitively, balanced the books, and the debt they owed me was one they would spend the rest of their lives trying to repay. The night of the party was a symphony of manufactured joy. Crystal flutes chimed, a string quartet played softly in the corner, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and roast duck, scents I only ever experienced as a distant, mocking whisper from my basement room. Tonight, however, I was not in the basement. I was seated at a small, deliberately inconspicuous table near the service doors, a ghost at the feast. From here, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of my daughter, Olivia. She was a vision in emerald silk, the dress shimmering under the recessed lighting of the grand hall she didn't own. She moved through the crowd of Austin's new money elite, her laughter bright and practiced, accepting compliments on a home she hadn't paid for, on a life she had stolen. I felt a strange calm, a chilling serenity that had settled deep in my bones over the past few weeks. The trembling rage, the suffocating humiliation, they had been burned away, leaving behind something hard and clear, like diamond. Every fawning guest who shook her hand, every sycophant who praised her generosity and devotion was simply another actor playing their part in a tragedy whose final act I had already written. 2 days ago, in the sterile quiet of the public library, I had attached the encrypted folder to an email. The folder was my life's work as a forensic accountant, condensed into a single, devastating payload. Audio files of Mark and Olivia planning my future in a state-run facility, scanned documents of their spiraling debt, and the crown jewel, a subfolder containing dozens of practice sheets of my forged signature, a digital monument to their methodical betrayal. I had typed David Chen's email address, my fingers steady on the keyboard. The subject line was simple: contingency protocol activated. The click of the mouse as I hit send was the quietest, most definitive sound I had ever made. David's reply had come within the hour. Received, Emma. The board is convened. The attorney is engaged. Await my signal. Now I was awaiting the signal. I picked at the dry dinner roll on my plate, the only food I had been offered. I watched Mark, his face flushed with champagne and self-satisfaction, place a proprietary hand on the small of Olivia's back. He leaned in and whispered something in her ear, and they both glanced in my direction, a shared, fleeting look of condescending amusement. They saw a frail, defeated old woman. They saw a problem that was close to being solved. They had no idea they were looking at their executioner. Mark tapped a glass with a spoon, the sharp ring cutting through the chatter. The room quieted. "Friends, family," he began, his voice booming with false sincerity. "If I could have your attention, the birthday girl, my incredible wife, would like to say a few words." A wave of applause rippled through the hall. Olivia stepped onto the low, carpeted dais they had set up near the grand staircase, beaming as if she were accepting an Oscar. She took the microphone from Mark, her manicured fingers closing around it. She was radiant, triumphant. She let the applause wash over her for a moment, a queen surveying her court. I felt nothing, no pain, no anger, just the cold, patient focus of a predator. "Oh, you guys," she sighed, a perfect little catch in her voice. "Thank you all so much for being here. It means the world to me to share my home, our home, with all the people we love." She gestured expansively. This year has been about building a life, building a future, and most importantly, building a legacy of family. I could see the influencers in the front row, their phones already up, recording for their TikTok stories. #dutiful daughter, #family first. The branding was impeccable. "A lot of you know," Olivia continued, her voice softening with practiced emotion, "that this year has also come with its own challenges. It's not easy, in this fast-paced world, to slow down and take on the responsibilities that truly matter." She paused, letting the weight of her feigned sacrifice settle on the room. Her eyes, shining under the lights, scanned the crowd, and then, as I knew they would, they found my little table in the shadows. She gave a small, sad, noble smile. It was time. The trap was about to spring. I knew the words before she said them. I had heard them whispered in contempt, muttered in frustration, and now they would be delivered as the centerpiece of her performance. "And I couldn't have done any of this without my mom," she said, her voice dripping with fraudulent piety. She made a small gesture in my direction, a flick of the wrist. The spotlight didn't move. I remained in the shadows as intended. "She's my rock, my inspiration. But as we all know, with age comes a certainty dependence." She is, and I say this with all the love in my heart, my most loving burden. The air in the room didn't just chill, it froze. The chatter died instantly, replaced by a dense, uncomfortable silence. A few people coughed. Someone dropped a fork, and the clatter against the marble floor sounded like a gunshot. The phrase hung in the air, ugly and sharp, a loving burden. The second time she had used it in public. The first time, it had shattered me. This time, it was my cue. It was the signal. As the shocked silence stretched, thick and suffocating, the grand oak doors at the front of the hall swung inward. The motion was slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud in the dead quiet. It wasn't a late-arriving guest. The figures standing in the doorway were silhouetted against the night, their presence immediately commanding and utterly out of place amidst the silk dresses and tailored suits. It was David Chen. He stood in the center, impeccably dressed in a dark, severe suit, his face a mask of cold professionalism. He looked like an undertaker arriving to claim a body. To his right stood a man in a rumpled uniform, a process server holding a thick manila envelope. And to his left, flanking him like sentinels, were two uniformed officers from the Austin Police Department. Their hands rested casually on their belts, their expressions impassive, their presence an immediate and terrifying shift in the reality of the evening. Olivia's smile faltered, confusion clouding her triumphant expression. She squinted towards the door, shielding her eyes from her own spotlight. "Mark?" she whispered, her voice a small, uncertain thing in the microphone, which squealed with feedback. "Who is that?" Mark, who had been preening by the side of the dais, straightened up, his jovial expression hardening into one of annoyance. He thought them party crashers, but they didn't stop at the entrance. They began to walk. Their footsteps were the only sound in the vast hall, a steady, rhythmic cadence on the polished marble. Thud, thud, thud. It was the sound of an approaching judgment. The crowd of guests, frozen in their seats, didn't just move aside, they seemed to shrink away, parting like water before the bow of a ship. Phones that had been recording Olivia's speech were now trained on the silent procession. The atmosphere had curdled from awkwardness into palpable fear. No one spoke. No one moved. They just watched as the four figures walked past the untouched buffet, past the string quartet that had fallen silent, their bows hovering over their instruments. They walked with an unnerving purpose, their destination clear. They stopped directly in front of the dais, their path ending at Olivia's feet. She was no longer on a pedestal. She was trapped on a stage, the bright light that had glorified her now serving to interrogate her. David Chen looked up at my daughter. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. In the tomb-like silence of the room, his words cut through the air with the precision of a scalpel. "Olivia Vance Miller," he began. His voice was calm, level, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a man reading an obituary. "Pursuant to the covenants of the Emma Vance Benevolent Trust, your position as resident manager is hereby terminated, effective immediately." Olivia blinked, a deer caught in the headlights. I don't understand. What trust? Resident manager. This is my house." A nervous laugh escaped her lips. "This is a mistake. Mom, what is this?" Her eyes darted around, finally landing on me. But I didn't meet her gaze. I simply took a slow sip of water, my hand perfectly steady. David continued as if she hadn't spoken, his voice an iron rod. "Your termination is for gross violation of the Dignified Care Clause, a binding condition of your residency." He let the phrase dignified care hang in the air, a direct echo of the insult she had just delivered. A few guests gasped, connecting the dots. The trap had been revealed. David gestured curtly to the process server. The man stepped forward and extended the manila envelope towards Olivia. She flinched back, refusing to take it. The server, without a word, placed it on the lectern beside her microphone. "You have 24 hours to vacate the premises," David stated, his tone flat and non-negotiable. Olivia's face, which had been a mask of confusion, was now crumbling into pure panic. Her eyes were wide with disbelief, her mouth slightly agape. She looked at Mark, her silent plea for help screaming across the few feet that separated them. Mark's face was ashen. The confident, boisterous host had vanished, replaced by a man who looked like he had just seen his own ghost. David then turned his gaze, cold and deliberate, upon Mark. "Furthermore," he said, and the word landed with the weight of a coffin lid, "evidence of conspiracy to commit fraud, felony theft by deception, and forgery has been submitted to the Travis County District Attorney's Office." He paused, letting the words sink into the horrified minds of everyone present. "A criminal investigation is now active." The two police officers took a subtle, coordinated step forward. It wasn't aggressive, but it was a clear and unmistakable show of authority. They were no longer just witnesses, they were custodians of the consequences. Mark seemed to physically shrink, his eyes fixed on the officers' badges. David's gaze swept across the room, encompassing every stunned guest, before finally returning to Olivia, who was now trembling, her hand gripping the lectern for support. He delivered the final, killing blow. "This house," he announced, his voice resonating with absolute finality, "and all associated assets have always belonged to the trust. A trust for which Emma Vance is, and has always been, the sole executor and beneficiary." He held up a hand, silencing the shocked whispers that were beginning to erupt. He looked directly at my daughter, a woman he had known since she was a child. There was no pity in his eyes, only the stark reality of the law. "The party," he said, his voice dropping slightly, but losing none of its power, "is over." The sound that tore from Olivia's throat wasn't a cry of grief or sadness. It was the shriek of something breaking, something hollow shattering on the marble floor. She crumpled, not gracefully, but in a heap of designer silk and shattered pride. Her wails were ugly, animalistic, echoing in the cavernous room that had, only moments before, been filled with her triumphant laughter. The carefully constructed queen of this glass castle had just been dethroned, and the sound was the scraping of her crown across the stone. Mark stood frozen beside her fallen form, a statue carved from fear. His face, usually flushed with wine and self-satisfaction, was a ghastly, bloodless white. His mouth hung slightly open, as if he'd been about to utter a clever toast, and the words had died on his tongue. His eyes darted from the two uniformed officers standing impassively by the door to David Chen's calm, resolute face, and then finally to me. They were wide with a frantic, desperate confusion, searching my face for a sign, an explanation, a tell that this was all just some horrible, elaborate joke. He found nothing. My face was a placid lake after a storm. The turmoil settled deep beneath the surface. The silence that had fallen like a guillotine was now being filled by a low, insidious murmur. The guests, a curated audience for Olivia's grand performance, were now spectators at her execution. I could see the phones, once held aloft to capture filtered moments of fabricated joy, now angled to capture the raw, unfiltered spectacle of her ruin. Their faces were a gallery of morbid fascination, pity mixed with a delicious, thrilling horror. They were the courtiers who had toasted the Empress, and now they were watching, transfixed, as her robes were stripped away to reveal the fraud beneath. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel anger. I felt a great, hollowing emptiness. But it was the clean, quiet emptiness of a room that has finally been cleared of clutter. The years of biting my tongue, of swallowing insults, of shrinking myself to fit into the cramped, dark spaces they assigned me, all of it began to drain out of me, leaving behind a profound and unnerving calm. The tension that had lived in my shoulders for years, a constant aching weight, simply dissolved. My hand, resting on the cheap tablecloth of my forgotten table, was steady. I watched it for a moment, this hand that had signed over my life, that had scrubbed their floors, that had trembled with cold in my basement room. Now, it was still. Slowly, deliberately, I pushed my chair back. The scrape of its legs against the floor was a small, sharp sound in the vast room, and it cut through Olivia's wailing. Every eye turned to me. I rose to my feet. I took a moment to smooth the front of my simple, dark blue dress, a dress I had bought myself, with my own money, on my one secret outing. The gesture was small, but it was for me. It was a reclamation. I began to walk. The crowd of gaping faces parted for me as if I were a ghost, which, in a way, I had been in this house for years. I walked past the table of Olivia's influencer friends, their mouths agape, their perfect makeup unable to hide their shock. I walked past the business associates Mark had been so desperate to impress, their expressions now a mixture of contempt and hasty retreat. I could feel their stares on my back, but my gaze was fixed forward, on the grand, arched doorway that had always felt like the mouth of a cage. My path took me directly past the spot where my daughter lay sobbing on the floor. I could smell her expensive perfume, a scent I associated with slammed doors and dismissive words. I could hear her ragged breaths, the desperate gulping sounds of someone who has lost everything. As I drew level with her, her wailing hitched. "Mom?" The word was a broken, pathetic thing, a child's plea from the mouth of a predator. It was a last, desperate attempt to pull the chain she had wrapped around my neck for years. I did not stop. I did not slow my pace. I did not turn my head. I kept my eyes on the open door, on the slice of cool, dark night that promised freedom. To look at her would be to engage. To acknowledge her would be to reopen a negotiation that had already been concluded. My silence was the verdict. My footsteps were the sentence. I walked through the doorway and into the crisp, clean air of the Austin evening. It felt like the first real breath I had taken in 5 years. The air in the house had been thick with lies, heavy with unspoken resentment. Out here, the air was just air. It was cool and clean, and it filled my lungs. David was waiting by a dark sedan parked at the curb. The engine was running. He wasn't looking at the house. He was looking at me, his expression one of quiet, profound respect. He didn't offer a hand to help me, knowing I needed to take these last steps on my own. He simply opened the rear passenger door and stood aside, a silent sentinel holding the gate to my new life. I slipped into the soft leather seat. David closed the door behind me, the solid, muffled thump, sealing out the sounds of the life I was leaving behind. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. As the car pulled away from the curb, I kept my eyes forward, watching the streetlights slide by, illuminating the road ahead. I didn't look back. The first thing I notice each morning now is the light. It spills across the polished hardwood floors of my condominium, a warm, golden river that chases away the shadows. There are no damp corners here, no smell of mildew and neglect. Just the scent of fresh coffee brewing and some days, the faint, turpentine smell of my oil paints. From my balcony, I can see the whole city waking up, a sprawling tapestry of a world I am finally a part of again. The view is vast and clear. The mansion, that opulent prison, was sold months ago. The transaction was a clean, impersonal affair handled by David. The proceeds were folded back into the Emma Vance Benevolent Trust, a name Robert had chosen that I once found overly sentimental. Now I understand. It is benevolent to me. The trust is no longer a secret weapon, but a fortress. Not one with walls to keep the world out, but one with a foundation strong enough to build a life upon. Twice a week, I have coffee with Eleanor and Susan. We sit in a sun-drenched cafe, the same one we used to frequent before Robert passed, before my world shrank to the size of a basement room. The first time we met again, there were tears and a few pained questions I answered as best I could. Now we just talk. We talk about books and politics and the outrageous price of avocados. Their laughter is real, a warm, familiar melody. "It's just so good to have you back, Emma," Susan said last week, squeezing my hand. And I realized she didn't just mean I was back in Austin. She meant I was back. I've taken up painting. My instructor is a patient young woman who tells me there are no mistakes, only opportunities. My first canvases were a mess of muddy, hesitant colors. But now, I'm getting bolder. I paint the sunrise I see from my balcony. I paint the funny, crooked flowers in the pot a neighbor gave me. I am not a great artist. I may never be. But the act of taking a blank white canvas and filling it with color, of creating something that didn't exist before, feels like a miracle. It is the opposite of being erased. My phone rings sometimes. The screen never shows a name, only the cold, anonymous words. Blocked number. I always know it's her. The first few times, my heart would hammer against my ribs, a conditioned response to a threat. Now, I just watch the screen light up. I can imagine the voice on the other end, thick with performative tears. I can hear the litany of excuses, the desperate begging for forgiveness, which would inevitably curdle into accusations and blame. She would cry about how her life is ruined, how her friends have abandoned her, how it's all my fault. She would be asking for money. She would be demanding that I fix the mess she made. I never answer. I press the red button on the screen and the ringing stops. The silence that follows is not empty. It is full. It is the sound of peace. It is the sound of a boundary being held. Answering would be an invitation for the poison to seep back in. My refusal is not an act of punishment. It is an act of preservation. Her downfall is a tragedy of her own making, a consequence of her own choices. My survival depends on my choice to no longer participate in her drama. My revenge was never about watching her world burn. I take no joy in her ruin. My victory wasn't in the moment she fell, but in all the moments since. Every sunrise I watch, every cup of coffee I share with a friend, every clean brushstroke on a new canvas. My revenge is in my own resurrection. They stood on that stage, in that house built with my life's savings, and they called me a burden, a weight holding them down from the life they deserved. They were so busy trying to soar that they never understood the ground beneath their feet. They never understood that I wasn't the burden. I was the foundation, and foundations can always be removed.